Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Inferno by Dante Alighieri, better known as Dante's Inferno. Now, Dante's Inferno is part one of a three-part epic poem called The Divine Comedy. Now, the Divine Comedy is a story in which Dante himself is the main character, and it's about him going through the three realms of the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and then heaven. Now, the other two parts of the Divine Comedy are the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. Now, while the poem itself is clearly a fantasy, it's important to remember that everything going on in the poem is basically a metaphor for things that were going on politically at the time, and things that were going on in Dante's life at the time. The poem is also very much about where Dante felt he was at spiritually at the time he wrote it. Now, I already reviewed this book back in 2015, and that review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2015 review of Dante's Inferno. Now, it is believed that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy sometime between the years 1308 and 1320. It's also interesting to note that the poem wasn't originally called the Divine Comedy. It actually didn't get that name until Giovanni Boccaccio, who was another famous Italian writer who was actually a generation after Dante. It was Boccaccio who gave the poem that name. Now, Dante was actually exiled from his home city of Florence due to his political activism, particularly his criticisms of Pope Boniface VIII. Dante was part of a group of Florentines who opposed the Pope and felt that the Pope had too much power. And you could tell that Dante's anguish and anger towards his being exiled and what he felt was happening to his homeland really does inform at least the Inferno, which is the most famous part of the Divine Comedy. Now, most literary works written at this time were actually written in Latin. Dante chose to write the Divine Comedy in his native tongue, which was Italian, and I believe it was actually very looked down upon at the time, but Dante did this to make it more accessible to people. And as a result, Dante is now considered to be the father of the Italian language. This is obviously an English translation of the book that I've read. Now, so much of the Divine Comedy and Dante's work in general is actually a tribute to a woman named Beatrice Portinari, who Dante met when they were both children. Now, by all accounts, Dante only actually met this woman maybe 3 or 4 times in his entire life, yet she became his artistic muse. Now, Beatrice died when she was only 25 years old, and Dante's first written work was a book called La Vita Nuova, which was a book about Dante's love for Beatrice, as well as a collection of love sonnets dedicated to this woman. Now, it should be noted that Dante was actually married. He was married to a woman named Gemma Donati, yet he never mentions his actual wife in any of his poems. Yet here was this woman who Dante hardly knew, who he makes not just a very important character in the Divine Comedy, but in the Divine Comedy, Beatrice is basically the voice of God. Like, he literally dealizes this woman. Now, it's weird to look at it from a 21st century perspective, because nowadays we would look at Dante's love for Beatrice and be like, okay, how could he have really loved this woman? He hardly knew her, and nowadays we would say, no, you have to get to know this woman's personality before you can say you love her. Also, it's hard to say what the real-life Beatrice would have thought had she lived to have seen what Dante made of her in his poems. Like, looking at it from a 21st century perspective, she probably would have thought, okay, this is a little creepy, but we gotta understand that in the Middle Ages, people had a very different view of love and courtship than people do now. Now, Dante definitely does draw from older works of literature with this story. Like, you could tell that his descent into hell was very much inspired by the scene from Homer's The Odyssey where Odysseus or Ulysses travels into the underworld. In fact, both Homer and Odysseus do show up in the Inferno. Another book that was clearly an influence on this was Virgil's The Aeneid. In fact, Virgil's writing in general was clearly an influence on Dante, because Dante makes Virgil a central character in both the Inferno and the Purgatorio. So, the plot of the Inferno, or Dante's Inferno, is it begins where Dante is lost in this dark wood, and he sees salvation in the form of a light at the top of this mountain, and when he tries to get to the light, his path is blocked by 3 beasts who drive him deeper into the woods. So, Beatrice, who now resides in heaven, calls upon the spirit of the poet Virgil to guide Dante to this light, and in order to get to the light, Virgil has to guide Dante through hell and then purgatory, and then when they get to the gates of heaven, Beatrice will take over for Virgil and guide Dante through the kingdom of God. So, Virgil rescues Dante from the wood, and together they descend into hell and go through the 9 circles of hell. Along the way, Virgil explains to Dante the structure and politics of hell and why a certain sinner ends up in a particular circle. Now, depending on how great your sin was, the deeper in hell and the further from God you go. And ultimately they reach the 9th circle where the angel Lucifer has been condemned for his rebellion against God. Now, Dante's Inferno is one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. I would say the entirety of the Divine Comedy, but I'll be lying if I said that the Inferno wasn't my favorite part of the Divine Comedy, even though I do love the entire poem as a whole. Like, it is a beautiful and remarkable piece of literature. Now, I first read this in high school, and it had a very profound effect on me, even though I'll be the first to admit that I didn't fully comprehend everything going on in the poem. It wasn't until learning a little bit more about Dante's life and learning a little bit more about the historical context in which the book was written where I've come to appreciate the work a lot more. And one of the reasons why the Divine Comedy, particularly the Inferno, has always appealed to me is because I've always had a fascination with the concept of the afterlife, particularly the concept of hell, even though I'm not sure if I personally believe in a hell. Now, I've spoken about my personal beliefs before. I do personally believe in God, or at least a God. Like, I do believe that our universe was set in motion by some kind of being or force, basically what we would call God. But I personally view religion in general, and this goes for all religions, as just man's way of trying to understand God. And by the way, I'm not trying to alienate anybody who is an atheist or is even a hardcore Christian. These are just my personal beliefs. But that being said, since I do believe in a God, but I don't count myself as a full-fledged Christian, I'm not entirely sure if I believe in heaven and hell in the traditional sense. I do believe in an afterlife, but I honestly believe it's more of a mindset thing than anything else. And yes, I'm well aware had I lived during Dante's time, I probably would have been burnt at the stake as a heretic. But I do believe if heaven and hell do exist, I believe there are other dimensions. Like, I don't believe hell is located under the ground, and I don't believe heaven is up in the clouds. I believe there are other planes of existence. But Dante's hell is very much a physical place located in the earth. Now, I don't know if this is literally what Dante believed hell to be like, but in the mythology that's presented in this poem, hell is actually the crater that was left behind when Lucifer hit the earth after being cast out of heaven. So hell in Dante's vision is a physical place with a geography that is actually malleable. And so much of our modern perceptions of hell came from this poem, particularly the Christian hell. Obviously, nearly all religions have their own takes on hell. Like the ancient Greeks had their depictions of Hades or the underworld, the ancient Egyptians had theirs. Actually, prior to Dante in the 12th century, there was something called the Hell Scrolls, which I think specifically depicted the Buddhist version of hell, and actually actually, a lot of the Eastern versions of hell kind of make Dante's hell look like Sesame Street. But even Dante's Inferno is not the first literary depiction of the Christian hell, because I believe Dante does draw a lot on what's known as the Apocalypse of St. Paul. But a lot of ideas and imagery that people tend to think of when they think of hell, particularly the Christian hell, and the idea of hell being broken up into 9 circles, that all comes from the Inferno. Now, all that being said, Dante actually does draw a lot from Greek and Roman mythology. For example, Limbo, which is the first circle of hell, is not all that different from how the ancient Greeks saw the afterlife. Basically, from what I understand, and believe me, I'm no expert on this, but I believe the ancient Greeks didn't really believe in divine reward after you died. Basically, they believed that whether you were good or bad, when you died, you went to Hades. And the first circle of hell really isn't that bad. It's really just for people who died before the birth of Christ and before the teachings of Christianity. The first circle of hell is where Virgil is from. And when Dante and Virgil first enter hell, they encounter Charon, who, according to Greek mythology, was Hades' ferryman who took the souls of the dead across the river Styx into the underworld. In the third circle of hell, Cerberus, the 3-headed dog from Greek mythology, tortures the gluttons. Before entering the 6th circle of hell, Dante and Virgil encounter the Furies, as well as Medusa, who tries to turn them to stone. In the 7th circle of hell, which is for the violent, in round 1, murderers have to suffer in this river of boiling blood, and whenever one of them tries to escape, they're shot with arrows by centaurs. And at a certain point, Dante and Virgil also encounter the Minotaur from Greek mythology, and in round 2 of the 7th circle of hell, suicides are turned into trees, and they're tortured by the Harpies. And then a lot of the punishments that the sinners suffer in Dante's Inferno mirror a lot of punishments that people who offended the gods have to suffer in Homer's The Odyssey when Odysseus goes to the underworld. And I already mentioned the influence that Virgil's The Aeneid had on this poem, because there is a part of the Aeneid where Aeneas goes to the underworld. And it's really interesting to see this combination of different mythologies between Christianity and Greek and Roman mythology, and you would almost think that this combination of different mythologies is more of a modern thing, but here was Dante doing that all the way back in the 14th century. Another thing that's really cool about Dante's Inferno is there's some actual character development in this. Like, in the beginning, Dante is, for want of a better term, kind of a pussy. Like, in the beginning, Dante is so horrified by some of the things that he sees that he actually faints at certain points, and in the beginning, Virgil doesn't really like him very much, and actually doesn't think that he's worth it, and Dante does have to prove his spiritual worth to Virgil, and Dante does find his courage as the story goes on. Now, the entirety of the Divine Comedy is definitely a meditation on Dante's religious and spiritual beliefs, as well as being kind of a love poem dedicated to both Beatrice and God. But part 1, the Inferno, which does kind of stand apart from the other two, I do think is very much a horror story. Like, there's some horrific and really creepy stuff in this, especially as you descend deeper and deeper into hell. Like, the suicide farce really is creepy as hell when you stop to think about it. And when you get to the 8th circle of hell, you just see sinners being eviscerated by the demons, and it gets really freaking gory. And when Dante and Virgil get to the 9th circle of hell, which is this giant frozen lake, and people who have committed betrayal are forever entombed in ice, and they encounter Satan himself, Dante is freaking terrified at what he sees. He's so horrified by what he sees that the way he describes it is, I did not die, but I was not living either. So basically, he kind of had to shut down all of his emotions just to approach this thing without going insane. But I also consider Dante's Inferno to be kind of a political satire because so much of this poem is really Dante massaging a lot of things that were pissing him off about society at the time, and he also places a lot of his political enemies and people that he had a grudge against in hell. And again, Dante was exiled from his homeland, and I think they actually put a death warrant on him. Like, they were gonna kill him if he returned to Florence, so you could see why somebody like Dante would be a little pissed off, and in some ways this poem is kind of a giant shitpost, even though they didn't have things like that back during Dante's time, but it's basically a giant shitpost that happened to become one of the greatest literary works of all time. And Dante, despite being a Christian, is actually very critical of the church in this, where some of the sinners that Dante encounters in hell are cardinals and popes, basically showing that no matter who you are, you're not exempt from God's judgment, even if you are a supposed man of God. Like, Dante is a man who very much saw corruption in the church, and in today's day and age where now we know so much about the sexual abuse that went on in the church, it kind of makes this even more relevant today. And by the way, I'm not attacking all people in the church. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that any organization, religious or political, can have corruption in it, and Dante very much saw that. And as horrifying as this story does get, there is actual humor in this. Now, the entire poem is called the Divine Comedy, but comedy meant something different during Dante's time, but there is some actual comedy in this. Like, in the 8th circle of hell, flatterers, so basically ass-kissers and brown-nosers, have to suffer in a literal river of shit. And then there's a demon who sends commands to other demons by farting, by making a trumpet of his rump, so there's no way that Dante didn't intend that to be humorous, so there is some definite humor in the Inferno. Also, and I am being somewhat of a smartass here, but I have heard Dante's Inferno referred to as a giant piece of fan fiction, and in a weird way, it kind of is, and that is oversimplifying it, but think about it. The story features Dante himself as the main character, basically going on an adventure with a personal hero of his. And Dante also places these characters from different stories and mythologies and different historical figures all together in the same story, almost as a crossover. Again, I am being kind of a smartass here, but can you deny that this is kind of fanfiction when you stop to think about it? And when Dante is in the 1st circle of hell, he sees all these historical figures like Socrates and Homer and Plato all together. Now, there are some things in the Inferno that definitely, by today's standards, would be considered problematic. For example, in round 3 of the 7th circle of hell, which is for people who committed violence against nature, Dante describes the sodomites suffering in a desert of burning sand, and a lot of scholars have taken sodomites to mean homosexuals. Now yes, you look at it today and it's horribly homophobic, and I could definitely see a gay person being deeply offended by this section of the poem. But, and by no means am I defending homophobia, but we also have to realize that Dante was a Christian in medieval Europe, and we have to take into account what the church's stance on homosexuality was at the time. But here's the thing, though. Dante, despite placing the sodomites in such a horrible punishment, he actually does regard them with compassion, especially a man among them named Bernetto Latinini, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name, who was somebody that Dante knew, who, according to the poem, it seems like he was Dante's teacher. However, some historians have kind of discredited that, and despite placing him in hell, Dante pays him the greatest tribute out of any of the other sinners in hell. And it's sort of implied that this man's spirit is so great that he can rise above the pain and suffering. But the fact that there was somebody in Dante's life who he had great respect and maybe even love for who might have been a homosexual or Dante might have suspected of being one really does say something, especially for the Middle Ages. But it's also possible Dante might not have actually meant homosexual by sodomite. Like, it's possible he could have just meant anybody who committed the act of sodomy, which is anal or oral sex. Another part of this poem that I could definitely see being problematic by today's standards is, in the 8th circle of hell, there's a part where Dante describes seeing the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, being sliced in half by a demon, and I could totally understand a Muslim reading this and being deeply offended by that, but again, we do have to keep in mind that this poem was written in the Middle Ages. Now, one thing that is kind of weird is at the end of the story when Satan is described, he's described as having 3 heads, and in one of his mouths, he chews on the head of Judas Iscariot, the biblical betrayer of Christ. And thematically, that does make a lot of sense for Lucifer, the angel who betrayed God, to chew on the head of the man who betrayed Jesus. But the thing that's kind of weird is in Satan's other 2 mouths, he chews on the heads of Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. That's just freaking bizarre to me. So is Dante equating Jesus Christ with Julius Caesar, a Roman dictator who kinda had it coming? But make of that what you will. But Dante's Inferno is an amazing and beautiful piece of literature that I think everybody should read at least once. I mean, I recommend reading the entirety of the Divine Comedy, but again, the Inferno I definitely think is the best part. Now, I forgot to mention that this poem is also partly where I got the namesake of this channel from. My channel is Canto 1408. The poem is broken up into cantos. A canto is basically a section of a long poem. Now, I do want to give a few words on this translation of the Inferno. Obviously, I read an English translation since I can't read Italian. Now, this is the John Sayardi translation, and I'm sure I butchered his name, and I actually really do like this translation. It's actually pretty easy to read. I have listened to an audiobook of the Henry Longfellow translation, which is probably the most famous English translation of this poem, and that one's definitely written more in Old English, so I do recommend getting this translation because the English is a little more modernized, I think. But I still think it maintains the flavor of the original version of the poem. Now I want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano giving his thoughts on Dante's Inferno. When it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this book's legacy.
Dante's Inferno, or as I like to call it, the ultimate journey into hell. Dante is one of the only people in history that you can tell to go to hell, and he'll look at you and just say, "I did, I mean, if you think about it, that is some real gangster stuff right there. That he can actually just, I mean, he went to hell and came back. Like, he has more cred than anybody in the world. Nobody can say they're tougher than him. I would love to see the kind of work he would have put out if hip-hop had come out back then. But since we'll never really know, I might as well just get on with the review. So Dante's Inferno, this is, if not my favorite, at least one of my favorite epic poems of all time. This is the poem that I wish I had written. This is the story that I envy so much because it is the ultimate story to me. It's the idea of this guy journeying into the afterlife or journeying into hell, and then eventually Purgatorio and Paradiso. And you get to see what hell looks like through his eyes. And the reason why I love this book too is because this to me is how hell should always look. Whenever somebody decides, to put hell in a story, they should always refer back to Dante's Inferno. Because Dante's Inferno really is the most demented version of hell you can ever imagine. And it actually is beautiful. All that demented imagery is actually really, really, really beautiful. It It reminds me of The Road. When you look at The Road, the book, the way that Cormac McCarthy describes the earth that's covered in ash is so mesmerizing, and it really opens your imagination. The same thing with this book. This book really paints a beautiful picture of hell, even though it is a really twisted thing. It's not like hell is like heaven, where it's all oceans and skies, or however people imagine heaven. Hell is exactly what it is. It's a torture prison. Just 9 circles of pure punishment and torment and devastation. It is horrifying to see what Dante saw when he went to hell. And yeah, I get it. People take this as a work of fiction. I don't. I choose to believe, out of my own ignorant mind, that this really happened. That Dante actually went into hell with Virgil and he got to see all this stuff. I know I'm crazy. I don't care. I'm choosing to believe it. I know my rational mind says, this is obviously fiction. But I'm going to believe it anyway because I don't care. It's my freedom of thought. I can do whatever I want in my head, so I'm just going to believe that this is true. If people can believe in, I don't know, gremlins and all that other crazy stuff that people believe, I could believe that this story is true. So, I believe that Dante really went into hell, and I believe that all the images that he saw are real. And that is why I started praying on Sundays and like Christmas and Easter and stuff like that, just to kind of, get my foot out of hell, because I know that most of my body is already almost going there. So at least if I could get my foot out of there, I'd feel a lot better. But anyway, the writing, beautiful. It is old style, so of course, if you're not used to old style writing, it's gonna be real tough. And believe me, the first time I read it, it was really tough. I had to read it really, really, really slow. I mean, really slow. It took me forever to read this book the first time. But, after I've read it a couple of times, then I kind of got used to it. And now when I read it every so often, I try to read it at least once a year, maybe once every other year. I am so used to it that it just goes by easily and I understand everything that's being said. But it does take practice because it is an older language. There are modern versions of it, so if you just want to read the story just to read the story, that's fine. But if you do want to read, what Dante wrote, then I would recommend getting the actual older language, even though it's not even the older language anyway. It's translated from Italian. So if you are if you're looking for the actual original version, I guess you're gonna have to learn Italian. I didn't have that much time, so I decided I'm just gonna read the English version, and I'm fine with that. Nothing against the Italian language, it's just that it's just easier for me. I'm really stupid, so I already know English and Spanish. To learn a third language I think it would melt my brain. And the other beautiful thing about the writing in this book is that if you read the way stuff is written back in the old days when they wrote epic poems or stories, a lot of it can feel really corny. I don't mean bad corny, I just mean that it doesn't really feel real. Like Achilles crying because he lost his woman in the Iliad. I don't know, it was like he was almost like a child. And so it's just gonna feel, most of those stories, they feel really corny sometimes, or things will happen where, it just doesn't feel real. It just feels corny. The beautiful thing about Dante's Inferno is, yes, even though the dialogue is written poetically, it still does feel like this is happening. Like, this feels real. It feels really, really realistic. It feels like, like if it's a modern story just told through an epic poem style. Nothing really feels corny to me or anything. So I think that's brilliant that Dante had that mind. Dante Alighieri is one of my favorite authors of all time. This one, Purgatorio and Paradiso, I love those books. The Divine Comedy is just the perfect trilogy. It's like the Lord of the Rings. It's like Star Wars. It's one of those things. It's just a perfect trilogy. And yes, you can only read Dante's Inferno if you want to, but I recommend that if you're going to read Dante's Inferno, read the other two so you could get the entire story, and it just works so well, it's fantastic, beautiful. Now I know I'm making it sound like it's a real exciting, action-packed story and all that stuff. It does keep you interested. Don't get me wrong. It's not boring or anything like that, but it's not uplifting either. This is a dark, depressing story, to be honest. I mean, you go into the circle of hell where the people who committed suicide are, and they've become trees, and it's just a really sad, depressing look at what happens to them after they die. You look at Lucifer when you finally get to the ninth circle of hell, and you see Lucifer with Judas, and you see him, how he's frozen in hell. It's just a really dark story. It's just really, really dark, and all the punishments, like I said, they're all just really dark and disturbing, and just keeps you, it does scare you if you want to take it as literal. It is a really scary story at the end of the day, and it is depressing because the idea that this place exists outside of life, that this is a place that you could go to, it's just so sad, to think about the people who are trapped in this place. No matter what they've done, it's just horrifying to think that they're even here. It's scary, and it's Dante does a really great job of showing that to you. There are some political messages in the story. I wouldn't worry too much about it unless you really want to know the history of it. You can look it up, that's fine. But I wouldn't worry about it because myself, I know the politics of the times. I get what Dante was trying to say with the Divine Comedy, but I don't really even care about any of that. For me, it's just I want to read the story, so I enjoy the story for what it is. And if you don't care about the history or anything, you just want to read a story to read a story, you'll have a good time. You don't have to really understand too much. I mean, you will have to understand some of the references because you're going to meet Achilles in hell. You're going to meet, you're going to see what Dante was showing you. He's going to reference to other things out there in other epic poems and songs and all this other stuff. So you might want to research that stuff. But when it comes to like the political times and what Dante was trying to say about the church and all that, you don't really have to know all of that. You kind of get it. You kind of get what the story is without having to go through all that. But like I said, if you want to, you can. My one goal in life, or no, not my one goal, but one of my goals in life is to pull an Anne Rice, pull a whoever else did it in our time, where they recreate this story in another way. That's one of my goals in life, is to write a story that's literally Dante's Inferno, just reimagined in my head. That's what I want to do. That has nothing to do with this book. I'm just saying that I love this book so much that that's what I want to do one day. I want to write a story that is literally a reinterpretation of Dante's Inferno. I love it, and I recommend everybody check it out, especially if you love epic poems, if you love old literature, if you love biblical stories, if you love any of that stuff, check this out, and I guarantee you will enjoy it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
So, I hope you enjoyed Christian's take on this book. Now, whenever I do these kinds of reviews, I love talking about the influence that a book had on pop culture, but in the case of Dante's Inferno, this didn't just influence popular culture, but this influenced culture in general. Like, not just the Inferno, but the entirety of the Divine Comedy really did sort of influence the way the church and a lot of Christians saw the afterlife in the centuries since it's been written. And it influenced so much from art to even architecture, and there's no way in hell, no pun intended, that I'm really going to be able to do justice to Dante's legacy. So instead, I'm going to focus on Dante's influence on other writers and on popular culture. Like, I already mentioned Giovanni Boccaccio, and Boccaccio actually wrote a biography on Dante called Life of Dante, which was also a very early example of the biography. And I've only read bits and pieces of the Decameron, but I'm sure there's probably a Dante influence on the Decameron as well. Geoffrey Chaucer tells the story of Count Ugolini in the Canterbury Tales, and even gives a shout-out to Dante in that book. Dante also had a huge influence on 17th century poet John Milton, and John Milton's most famous work, Paradise Lost, probably wouldn't exist if not for Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante also had an influence on the poems of T.S. Eliot. Dante was also a huge influence on 20th century Greek author Nikos Kazantzakis. Kazantzakis also translated a lot of Dante's work to Greek and even compared himself to Dante in his lifetime. Also in Nikos Kazantzakis' book, The Last Temptation of Christ, whenever hell was referred to in that book, it was referred to as the Inferno. There was a 1947 Malcolm Lowry novel called Under the Volcano, and in that book the main character's descent into alcoholism was meant to be a parallel to Dante's descent into hell. There was a 1976 fantasy novel called Inferno, written by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, which was written as sort of a modern sequel to the Inferno, and that book also had a sequel in 2009 called Escape from Hell. Now, I'm intentionally skipping over a lot of other books that were based on the Inferno, because, frankly, it's just too many to name. You also had Richard Matheson's 1978 novel, What Dreams May Come, which was about the afterlife, and you could definitely see an influence of the Divine Comedy on that novel. There was a 1985 novel called Across the Akron by Monique Wistik, I'm probably not saying her name right, which was sort of a feminist retelling of the Divine Comedy. Now, I can't say that this next book I'm gonna bring up was necessarily inspired by the Divine Comedy, but the opening line of Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho is, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," which is probably the most famous line from Dante's Inferno. In Menach the Devil, the fifth book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, the devil comes for the vampire Lestat and takes him on a tour of the afterlife, and that book really did feel like sort of a reimagining of the Divine Comedy, only using Lestat as a stand-in for Dante, and using the devil called Menach in that novel as a stand-in for Virgil. Now, in Stephen King's fantasy series, The Dark Tower, the main villain of that series was a demon called the Crimson King, who was implied to be the devil, but in that series, I believe at some points the Crimson King is referred to as Dis, and Dis was also the name of the city of fallen angels in the Inferno, and is another name for the devil in Dante's poem. There even is a direct Dante reference in the fourth Dark Tower novel, Wizard and Glass, when the main characters enter that emerald building created by Randall Flagg. The quote, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," is above the entrance. There was a 2003 novel called The Dante Club by Matthew Pearl, which was about a group of poets who were translating Dante's Divine Comedy into English, and then they had to solve a series of murders that paralleled the punishments in the Inferno. There was a 2004 contemporary adaptation of Dante's Inferno by Marcus Sanders and Doug Harvey, and I believe they also did adaptations of the other two books in the Divine Comedy as well. And then you had the fourth book of Dan Brown's Robert Landon series, which was called Inferno, and I believe in that book the villains had some kind of plot that was inspired by Dante. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the Inferno and Dante's Divine Comedy is over 700 years old. In a lot of ways, you could say that the whole of contemporary literature owes something to Dante. And you could find Dante references anywhere. I mean, I forgot to mention how in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, when Frankenstein is first describing his creature, he describes it as something that not even Dante could conceive. I'm also currently rereading Robert McCammon's Swan Song, which is a book about the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust, and in that book, one of the characters describes the nuclear apocalypse as Dante's Inferno. There have also been comic book and graphic novel adaptations of Dante's Inferno. Actually, one of the issues of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, Down Amongst the Dead Men, was kind of a modern take on Dante's Divine Comedy, only it used Swamp Thing as a stand-in for Dante. Also, there are certain points in Neil Gaiman's Sandman series where the main character Morpheus has to go to hell, and you get some direct Dante references in those sections of that comic. And speaking of comics, in the Spawn comics, you have the demon Malbolgia, and the name Malbolgia is derived from the word Malabolge, which is what Dante called the 8th circle of hell. There was also a Godzilla comic from a few years ago called Godzilla in Hell, where Godzilla actually goes to hell, and you get some direct Dante references in that comic. So almost any story that has to do with hell, you could argue, owes something to Dante's Inferno. Now, there have been several film adaptations of Dante's Inferno. As far as I know, only the Inferno has been adapted to film. I don't think there have ever been any straight adaptations of the Purgatorio or the Paradiso. But the first film adaptation of Dante's Inferno came out in 1911, and as far as I know, I believe that's considered to be one of the oldest surviving feature-length films. It's an Italian film, which is fitting considering that Dante's Inferno is considered to be the most famous piece of Italian literature. But the 1911 adaptation of Dante's Inferno is actually a pretty interesting movie, especially if you're interested in film history and in silent films. Now, a lot of the special effects in the movie is not even remotely realistic looking, like the scene where Beatrice reveals herself to Virgil and commissions him to guide Dante through hell. Behind her head is what's supposed to be a halo, or the light of God, and it's so clearly a fan running behind her head. Also, when you see Cerberus, it's so clearly a puppet. But the film is over 100 years old, so if you're going to criticize special effects from a movie that came out when film was in its infancy, then you're kind of a douchebag. But that being said, there actually is some cool claymation effects in the film, like the scene where one of the thieves is being transformed into the reptile-human hybrid. And the movie is actually quite gory for a film that came out in 1911. Now, I know Tangerine Dream did a score for the movie in 2004, I think, and scenes from the movie have been used in later adaptations of Dante's Inferno, as well as other films like Hellovision and Go Down Death, as well as Kenneth Anger's inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts on the 1911 version of Dante's Inferno, I did a review of it last year. There was a 1924 film called Dante's Inferno, which from what I understand was only a loose adaptation, and I believe that movie also took a lot of elements from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Another loose adaptation was the 1925 film Maccus in Hell, which was part of the long-running Maccus series. Now, while definitely not being a straight adaptation of Dante's Inferno, it does take direct elements from Dante's poem. For example, the main villain of the movie is the demon Barbarisi, who is one of the demons that Dante and Virgil encountered in the Inferno, and when you see Lucifer in that movie, it's so clearly the Lucifer from the Inferno. But Maccus in Hell, or I think the proper pronunciation of the character's name is Maccus T, that's always been one of my favorite silent films. There was a 1935 film called Dante's Inferno, which again I think was more of a loose adaptation, and I actually think that one might have been a direct remake of the 1924 film. In 1967's This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse, which was the second film of the Coffin Joe series, there's a dream sequence in that film where the main character is dragged to hell, and you can tell that hell in that movie was very much inspired by Dante's Inferno, with sort of the mixture of fire and ice, and the way the sinners are frozen in the ice. There was a 1972 Swedish comedy called The Man Who Quit Smoking, which was a very loose adaptation of the Divine Comedy. The main character of that movie actually was called Dante Alighieri. In 1975, you had Pier Paolo Pasolini's controversial final film Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, which, while obviously being an adaptation of the book by Marquis de Sade, also took a lot of elements from Dante's Inferno, where the film was broken up into different circles. There was a 1987 short film called The Dante Quartet, which was inspired by the Divine Comedy. There was a 1990 miniseries called A TV Dante, which adapted the first 8 cantos of the Inferno. I also always saw the movie Jacob's Ladder as sort of a loose adaptation of Dante's Inferno, because that movie is about a man's personal journey through hell. Now, in Kevin Smith's Clerks, the main character is called Dante. Now, granted, Dante is a common name, but I've always wondered, since the main character of that movie does figuratively go through hell, I always wondered if his name was meant to be a Dante's Inferno reference, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because Kevin Smith is a smart writer. There are a lot of Dante references in David Fincher's Seven, which is about a serial killer who kills people based on the 7 deadly sins. There was a 2007 comedy film called Dante's Inferno, which was a loose adaptation of Dante's poem, and the whole movie was done with, like, paper cutout puppets. I haven't seen the movie yet, but it actually sounds pretty interesting. In 2010, you had the video game based on Dante's Inferno, which I've never played. I'm not a gamer, but from what I understand about that game, it reimagines Dante as a Templar knight who has to go into hell to save Beatrice from the devil, which is kind of the exact opposite of what it is in the book, because technically in Dante's original poem, it's really Beatrice who saves Dante. Personally, I thought the game looked pretty stupid, to be honest, but there was an animated film adaptation of the game released the same year, and the game also spawned a spin-off comic book series, and for several years now, there have been talks of doing a live-action adaptation of the game. The 2014 horror film As Above, So Below also took some elements from the Inferno, and so did the 2018 Lars von Trier film, The House That Jack Built. Actually, the second half of that movie was basically a loose adaptation of the Inferno, where the main character was going through hell and was actually being guided by Virgil, and he was even wearing a robe in that movie very similar to the famous red robe that Dante is said to have worn. There's even a scene in the third John Wick movie where one of the hitmen going after John Wick quotes Dante. And yeah, I know, I seem to just be randomly naming off every Dante reference in pop culture that I could think of. Now, I already mentioned the video game adaptation of this poem. You also had the video game Devil May Cry. Now, again, I'm not a gamer, but I believe that game is about a demon hunter who is actually part demon himself, but the main character of that game is called Dante, and that's obviously a reference to this poem as well. You also had the Iced Earth song Dante's Inferno. Again, you could find references to this poem all over pop culture, because this is one of the most influential pieces of literature ever written. But yeah, that was my review on the Inferno by Dante Alighieri, and bye.